How it ever happened, of course, I don't know that anybody can explain it. It did just happen. Nobody said, definitely, we will all have a truce right along the line and there will be no firing. Nobody said that. It just occurred.
During a war, suddenly meeting the enemy and talking to them and exchanging souvenirs and things with them, well, so quite unheard of, sort of unexpected sort of thing. Well, I'm sure it was stand out in anyone's memory.
If the truce had gone on and on, there's no telling what could have happened. It could have meant the end of war. After all, they didn't want war and we didn't want war. And it could have ended up by finishing the war altogether.
In 1914, on the Western Front at Christmas, British and German soldiers ceased firing and met and fraternized openly in no man's land. This is an event still vivid in the minds of the men who took part in it. Leslie Walkington was one of them. Now 84, he was then a mere 17-year-old who joined the Queen's Westminster Rifles as an ordinary soldier on the outbreak of war. Now he lives in active retirement on the country estate which he managed for many years on the fringes of Dartmoor. Albert Moran was also there. He too is 84 and was 17 when he volunteered. He became a private in the Queen's Regiment. Later he was severely wounded but recovered to spend a busy working life as a tailor and now lives quietly at West Bromwich. Graham Williams is 88. In 1914, he was a 21-year-old rifleman of the London Rifle Brigade, generally known as the LRB. As a territorial soldier, he was already pledged to king and country when war began. After a career in the post office, he now lives in Brixham, Devon. For all these men, their journey to France in the autumn of 1914 was the beginning of a strange adventure from which they count themselves lucky to have escaped with their lives. But at the time, they marched with cheerfulness and determination to the war which they'd been confidently assured would be over by Christmas. And indeed, for them it was to be over by Christmas, for a brief, remarkable interlude, to resume again brutally and for 4 long years, when Christmas was over. Rifleman Williams had his first taste of life at the front at Ploegsteert in Belgium, Plug Street to the Tommies. Elsewhere that autumn there was heavy fighting. Almost 100,000 British soldiers were to become casualties by the end of 1914. But Plug Street was, on the whole, quiet, cushy. For Graham Williams and the LRB, it was to be a relatively easy introduction to war.
It was very quiet indeed, but most of the time there was nothing doing at all. There was no use firing unless there was something to fire at, and most of the time there was nothing to fire at. Just saw the German parapet. At night occasionally there was a bit of firing because Verilights were being sent up by both sides more or less all the time, and as they moved they sort of cast moving shadows of a bush or a depression in the ground that could be easily mistaken for a person moving about. But during the day there was not, as I say, only just a sniper now and then. If anyone rash enough to show his head above the parapet, 10 chances to 1 to get a sniper's bullet somewhere near him if it didn't get him. But apart from that, it was quite quiet.
Private cameras were officially not allowed, but many men still had them and took snaps of each other, even in the trenches. But as winter approached and the weather worsened, conditions at the front deteriorated too. For Rifleman Walkington of the Queen's Westminsters, his principal memory of the weeks before Christmas is of mud.
Been a lot of rain, and of course when you get rain on fields and farm tracks, and a lot of people walking up and down, obviously it gets pretty muddy. And it was very much like that, getting up to the trenches before one ever got into them. One was halfway up to one's knees probably and struggling along with a pack and a rifle and a blanket and goodness knows what. That was a big ordeal. And when you got into the trenches themselves, we were literally just in a sort of ditch.
Leslie Walkington's battalion was 7 miles south of Plug Street, in the open agricultural land east of Armentières. Albert Morin's territory was almost 3 miles to the southwest, among the marshy fields and distinctive willow trees near Bois Grenier and Fleur Bay. Here, he and his comrades of the Second Queens, many of them mere boys, settled into the regular routine of trench life.
You know, as soon as it got daylight, we'd have stand to, and then everybody will be on the lookout in case there's a morning attack. And then, of course, afterwards, it was all settled down. You'd have your rations. Your rations would be brought to a communication trench, and the water carriers would bring you some water if you were lucky. And the normal things. The company officer would come along the lines from other A, B, or C, D company and inspect you, and then you'd start the normal duties on sentry go, take it on in turns, 2 on, 4 off, 2 on, hours on, 2, 4 hours off, that sort of thing.
As Christmas approached, the British were entrenched along a front of about 30 miles, centred on Armentières. Between the opposing trenches was no man's land, and on the other side of no man's land was the enemy, the army of Kaiser Bill.
Well, the Germans were about, I think, 300 yards away. We really didn't know anything about them. We just thought, well, poor so-and-sos are in the same kind of muck as we are, and we hated their guts. When they killed any of our friends, we really did dislike them intensely. But otherwise, we sort of joked about them, and I think they joked about us.
The distance between the lines varied considerably. On other parts of the front, the British were a good deal nearer to the Germans, as Albert Morin recalls.
We were so close, we threw tins over to them and they threw things back. Bully beef and jam and biscuits. It wasn't done regularly, it was just an occasional sort of thing, naturally. We could hear the Germans talking at night, singing and everything. They used to shout across, Englander, Englander, you know. And we used to say, good old Jerry and things like that.
At this stage of the war, there was still a genuine fellow feeling between the British and German ordinary soldier that was to be largely lost later on.
We were very much against the German government and the policy of the German government, and the Kaiser particularly. But the individual Germans, well, we thought they were just doing their job in the same way as we were. Although, of course, if it had been an attack, we'd have shot them all right, the same as they'd have shot us. I mean, it was sort of being shot was sort of occupational hazard, and it applied to both sides, and that's the way we sort of looked at it.
A week before Christmas, the British launched a number of attacks on the German lines, with heavy casualties. Afterwards, in some sectors, British and Germans met between the trenches to bury their dead. Such arrangements are not unusual in war. Perhaps what was unusual was that both sides fraternized, if briefly, in no man's land, a portent of what was to come. Meanwhile, Christmas was rapidly approaching. Back home, the newspapers advertised suitable gifts for the fighting men.
No present will be more eagerly welcomed at the front than a parcel of really good, warm clothing. The added comfort and protection will mean much to the men who are keeping watch day and night in trenches rimmed with ice, whose aim must be steady, though their fingers shake with cold. Send them Hope Brothers 5-shilling parcel.
Many of the presents advertised were strictly practical. But there were seasonal suggestions too, such as, from a well-known establishment in London, a 15-shilling Christmas box, including tinned roast turkey, tinned Christmas pudding, chocolates, and other appropriate delicacies. In France, the soldiers set about fostering the Christmas spirit themselves. Indeed, reports in the press that the Tommies were eagerly collecting mistletoe began to cause grave anxiety among sweethearts and wives in Britain. In most cases, they need not have worried. For the Germans, too, the seasonal spirit was in the air, as thousands of Christmas trees were dispatched to the front. For both sides, the symbols of an almost forgotten normality were very important that year. The Germans were not to be short of appropriate fare for the festivities to come. Officers and men received spiced cake, apples and nuts. Drink was also to be in good supply. The Christmas mail for the Tommies was phenomenal. The Times reported the arrival in France of 2.5 million letters and 450,000 parcels. There was a Christmas card, too, for every individual soldier, from the King and Queen. The cards carried the touching message, "May God protect you and bring you home safe." And from another member of the royal family, there was a personal present for every soldier. Princess Mary's box, containing for the smoker tobacco and cigarettes, chocolates for the rest. Like the royal cards, these boxes became prized possessions.
Well, this is a box that all the troops had. It was from Princess Mary. You can see there's the tobacco and the cigarettes. I'm afraid I've smoked one or two, much against my wife's wishes. And the card, as you can see, is the Christmas card from Princess Mary. The message, there's a photo. And she says, "With best wishes for a happy Christmas and a victorious New Year from Princess Mary and friends at home." And the other card was in a letter from Buckingham Palace, a gift from Mary Rex and the women of the Empire, 1914.
Meanwhile, in the estaminets, the tiny hostelries of France and Belgium, which served as pub, club and social centre for soldiers out of the trenches, other Christmas arrangements were being planned.
As a matter of fact, we expected to be out of the trenches for Christmas, and we had made arrangements with different estaminets and places to fix up a Christmas dinner there, for them to provide a chicken or something of the sort, and we'd provide all the things from our parcels, Christmas puddings and mince pies and so forth. But then on December the 23rd, a day before Christmas Eve, we suddenly found that each LRB company, each of the four companies, had then been firmly attached to one of the four regular battalions. Our company, number 2 company, or B company, were attached to the Somerset Light Infantry, and we were also informed that we were to relieve them that evening, on the 23rd in the evening. So we thought, oh, bang goes our Christmas. We were rather fed up about that. Next morning, Christmas Eve, was a beautiful, bright winter's day, cold, but very sunny and bright and quite a pleasant day. The only thing which all marred it was during breakfast time, a chap in the next bay to us, was a very popular young singer in the company. He was shot through the head by a sniper.
Later, they photographed his grave, with its telltale date, 24/12/14. And now the night of Christmas Eve was drawing on. And for many soldiers in the trenches, this was to become the most memorable Christmas of their lives.
It was a Christmas card, Christmas Eve. There was a white, beautiful moonlight, frost on the ground, almost white everywhere. And round about, I think about 7 or 8 in the evening, we heard this singing, a lot of commotion, and we saw some lights. I don't know what they were, some lights. And later, we heard them singing, "Still a Silent Night." Still enough, Silent Night. I shall never forget it. It's one of the highlights of my life, absolutely, to see them. I thought, what a beautiful tune.
Rifleman Williams, at that time, was on watch 10 miles to the north, in a front-line trench on the edge of Plug Street Wood.
I was standing there on duty, and gazing across, looking across towards the German parapet, and nothing much going on, but I thought, well, a very different Christmas this is going to be from any I've spent up till now. I thought about this time at home we should have finished putting up all the greenery and holly and stuff. And my father would have been just finished making his rum punch, which he always did at Christmas. Anyway, I thought, my word, I could just do with a swig of that rum punch now, and feeling pretty miserable altogether. Then all of a sudden, lights appeared all along the German trench. And I thought, well, that's a funny thing. And then the Germans started singing, "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht." And I woke up, but all the other sentries did the same thing. We all woke up the other people to come along and see this, what on earth's going on. They finished their carol, we applauded them, and then we thought we must retaliate in some way, so we replied with the First Noel, and when we'd finished that, they all began clapping, and then they struck up another favourite carol of theirs, O Tannenbaum, which is the same tune as the Red Flag. And so we went on, first the Germans singing one of their carols, then we'd sing another of ours, until then we started up Come All Ye Faithful, and the Germans immediately joined in, singing the same thing to the Latin words of Adeste Fideles. And well, I thought this was rather an extraordinary thing, really, to think of the two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war.
They sang something and we applauded, and then we sang something back, and they applauded. I think they were perhaps a bit better at it than we were. They're very fond of male voice choirs, aren't they, the Germans? And they would sing things like Stille Nacht and all that, and sing them really rather beautifully.
Christmas morning, 1914. Behind the front, a formal church parade. At the front, the atmosphere of the night before still prevailed.
It was rather foggy, actually, at first that morning, but when the fog cleared, we began to climb out of the trench and wave, and then quickly jump in again in case they shot at us. But nobody did shoot, and eventually several people got out, and some of us went forward beyond our barbed wire. Anyway, eventually a couple of chaps met in no man's land and shook hands and turned round and waved, and we all cheered, and then we flocked out like a football crowd, sort of, running as fast as we could. It was very broken ground, and people fell into shell holes and things, but still we all got into the middle eventually, and we began to shake hands, and then we began to swap things like cigarettes and cigars and chocolate and cognac, and we gave them a bit of rum and so on, and everything got very friendly and happy. And we stayed out there the whole of the day.
Meanwhile, similar unwarlike scenes were being repeated over two-thirds of the British 30-mile front, as battalion after battalion joined in the most remarkable act of fraternization in modern war.
The no man's land was an extraordinary sight. It was full of parties of Germans and British all meeting each other and talking and laughing and exchanging souvenirs, exchanging buttons and cap badges and so forth. I was walking along and a chap came up to me and he actually greeted me with the words, "What's your cock, how's London?" Well, I said, "Good Lord, you speak English?" Well, he said, "Well, I am English." "No," I said, "you speak like a Londoner." He said, "Well, I'm a Londoner." I said, "Well, what the hell are you doing in the German army?" He said, "Well, I'm a German Londoner." And apparently I think he'd been born in Germany, but he'd gone to England immediately afterwards with his parents, and they had a small business in the East End of London somewhere. And he'd been brought up in England and gone to school in England and everything.
It was all quiet, no firing, and no guns, artillery. And we had rumours passed along the line that there was a meeting with the Germans and British, but we didn't think any more of it. Until later, we saw the Germans coming out their trenches near us, almost opposite. And we, all curious, did the same thing. We came out of our trenches and we walked towards these Germans. And of course, not many of them spoke English. We did find one, a young waiter. He told us he'd worked at De Kaiser's Royal Hotel, Blackfriars in London. He had a wife and 2 children. And he said he didn't want the war at all. And I think, if that sort of thing had gone on more, we may have seen the end of fighting, the end of the war.
How it ever happened, of course, I don't know that anybody can explain it. It did just happen. Nobody said, definitely, we will all have a truce right along the line and there will be no firing. Nobody said that. It just occurred. And but it is all... it made us, you see, I was only a very irresponsible young private soldier then, with no responsibilities at all, and it just made us all roar with laughter because we thought of all the generals and people probably going purple in the face, and there's nothing they could do. And anyway, it turned out all right. Germans were in the same position, obviously. And the only final result of it was that, and we were quite happy about it, was that we had taken out the front line, and it was a beastly bit of front line, about knee-deep in water, where I was living. So we were pulled out of the front line that night, and we said, well, jolly good, a very fine result of a truce.
These are some of the many photographs taken that Christmas time in no man's land, as both British and Germans produced their cameras and cheerfully photographed each other. Many exchanged items of clothing, so that in some photographs you can hardly tell one nationality from the other. Pictures of this event became valued souvenirs, to be kept in albums and carefully annotated. Most frequently of all, it was the Saxons with whom the truces occurred. "We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons," they are reported to have said in one sector. "Why should we fire on each other?" Even top-line battalions took part, like the 2nd Scots Guards. This album contains a special souvenir, a signature of a German soldier from Leipzig, acquired between the trenches on Boxing Day. Inevitably, the truce was a predominant subject in the letters the soldiers wrote home. This letter was written on December the 27th.
My dear Mum, on Friday morning, Christmas Day, the Germans came out of their trenches and we had an armistice the whole day till it was dark, and we buried our dead. I talked to several of the Germans during our armistice, and I must say they seemed very decent fellows, and palled up with our men.
This letter, which was begun on Christmas Day itself, added another twist to the story. The writer reported the usual cheerful fraternizing between the trenches, with much use of cameras, and added,
"We are having another truce on New Year's Day, as the Germans want to see how the photos come out."
I have a letter here that I wrote on Boxing Day, 1914. My dear father, mother and girls, just a line to let you know that we've had quite a merry Christmas, and indeed a very novel one. Would you believe it? By mutual consent, our battalion and the Germans opposite had a little armistice. We didn't fire a shot all day. It was really funny to see the hated antagonists standing in groups, laughing and talking and shaking hands. Of course, we didn't talk about who was going to win or anything touchy like that. It was a beautiful day. The ground was white with frost. Some of them were trying to arrange a football match, but it didn't come off. Talk about peace and goodwill, I never saw a friendlier sight. We tried to explain to each other that we bore no malice.
There were some poignant joint burials that day, with working parties from both sides busy together in no man's land. On one sector, a British chaplain and a German divinity student shared the service between them. And there were burials too behind the lines, in the little regimental cemeteries. The news of the truce took some time to get into the papers back home, but by early January a spate of reports began, inspired largely by soldiers' letters from the front. Almost every paper carried its own variation of the event. This was when stories of football matches with the enemy became part of the popular mythology of the Christmas truce. But they did happen, and football results were published. The Times reported,
The blank regiment actually had a football match with the Saxons, who beat them 3-2.
And one soldier wrote this in his diary account of Christmas Day.
After lunch, we sent a cyclist back to find a football. On his return, we played them a match, winning easily by 4-1.
More and more curious details were reported. But the newspapers carried sad stories too, such as this, the report of the death of Sergeant Collins of the 2nd Monmouthshires, shot by a sniper while taking cigarettes to a Bavarian regiment. The Bavarians later apologized. Collins, in fact, was killed in action, offering woodbines to the enemy. In some places, the truce went on for days, and it had a military justification too. It allowed both sides to repair and improve their trenches. It was a strange experience to work unchallenged in the open, unworried about snipers' bullets. This photograph shows British in the foreground and Germans in the background, ignoring each other completely. But it could not last. Stern orders began to come through from above. The London Rifle Brigade's war diary recorded on the 2nd of January 1915 to the effect that
informal truces with the enemy were to cease, and any officer or NCO found having initiated one would be tried by court-martial.
The German authorities reacted in similar vein, as the Times reported.
By an army order of December the 29th, fraternizing, and especially every approach to the enemy, is forbidden. And in future, every infraction of this order will be punished as treason.
So the fighting went on. There were to be 3 more wartime Christmases.
Christmas 1915, we were holding the line up in Flanders still. Previously we'd been on lines of communication all the summer. We were up in Flanders again, in the St. Eloi district. But we weren't actually, our battalion wasn't actually in the trenches over Christmas. We were in Poppering, in billets. But we'd had an order just before Christmas that under no conditions would there be any fraternising with the enemy this Christmas. It was quite a definite order. And the same thing applied every Christmas afterwards. 1916, 1917, I wasn't there because I'd been wounded. But I think it was all through every year they still repeated this order, no fraternisation. And there never was, as far as I know.
But other truces did occur, and in other areas too. On the Eastern Front, the armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary were in confrontation with the Russia of the Tsars. The waste and suffering on this front is largely lost in our modern imagination under the shadow of the Russian Revolution of 1917. But in this almost forgotten theatre of war too, the spirit of goodwill and humanity broke through. Not at Christmas, at Easter. An episode on the Galician front in 1916 is remembered by an Austrian doctor now living in retirement in Bath, then a medical officer attached to the Hungarian army, Friedrich Kohn.
Easter Sunday in 1916, snow masses everywhere, great amounts. At 6 o'clock in the morning, suddenly a few Russians appeared from their trenches, waving a white flag and approaching our lines. Well, some of our people went out to meet them, and they suggested whether we shouldn't have a holiday, so to say, Easter Sunday, stop the war and meet between the lines and have something to eat and to drink, which both of us were able to provide. Well, the question was, that the local commanding officer was not in a position to say yes or no. He inquired at the higher command, and they refused to give permission at all. So we said to people that we are sorry, but we cannot meet. But in spite of that, at about 12, there came about 20, 30 people out of the Russian trenches, we waving again white flags, carrying baskets with all that we didn't know. And a military band appeared as well, playing, and in the end, we came out too, and we met them, and we had a meal with them. I had the opportunity to talk to a colonel who was in command of the artillery section, and he spoke perfect German, that he was living about a few years in Vienna, and I asked him, why do you always send shrapnels and grenades to my first aid post? He said, it won't happen anymore. It didn't, really, until he said, if I should go, then I will send a rocket to tell you that we are off, which he did.
For Friedrich Kohn, this event was just one episode in a long life, which later included imprisonment under the Nazis and the dislocation of being a refugee. But for him, it still remains a major revelation about men and war.
I've seen demonstrated in front of my own eyes that suddenly people who kill each other, and will going to kill them again when the day is over, still are able to sit together and talk to each other.
But such moments were sadly rare in a war which became more and more mindless and devouring. And so it is images like these, not the scenes of fraternization, of peace in no man's land, that come to mind whenever that war is mentioned. And as the fighting continued, and humanity seemed lost in bigger and longer battles, in new and frightening technology, so the idea of shaking hands, joking and exchanging souvenirs with the enemy seemed increasingly remote and unreal, until finally many soldiers who fought in France came to believe that such events had not, indeed could not have happened. For them, this was no man's land, this zone of desolation, and the Christmas truce was a myth, a fiction, an agreeable story, irrelevant to the killing game still going on. Yet it did happen, and perhaps it's appropriate that the landscape of the Christmas truce is not permanently scarred, like other parts of the old Western Front. The relics of war are few. Here and there are screw pickets, on which in the later years of the war both sides hung their barbed wire entanglements. They're now used by the local farmers to support their fences. Here and there are old crumbling concrete bunkers, also relics of later battles. In Plug Street Wood, which never suffered the cruel mutilation of the infamous woods of Ypres or the Somme, can still be found a concrete first aid post, with its oddly evocative name still visible on the lintel. Blighty Hall. It's as fitting a landscape as any for this 20th century story of temporary peace and goodwill.